And last week we talked about the parables of Jesus and how they relate specifically to the commission. So Jesus came down to earth and he had a goal in mind. He had a goal to spread the message of this new covenant. And he needed people who would follow him and continue spreading that message when he was crucified, when he rose, and when he ascended into heaven. He wasn't going to be here eternally to continue preaching the message of the gospel, and he needed somebody who could follow in his footsteps. And the way that he explained it, the way that he tried to take heaven, bring it down to earth, and explain it to individuals who had never seen it, was through parables. At the same time, his parables not only said, go out and tell people, it told them, what are you going to tell them about? And that's what we're going to cover this week. We're going to talk about the parables as they relate to the new covenant, as they relate to the covenant that Jesus brought with him, the gospel message. And that's what we're going to cover. So how is Jesus going to take this old covenant? How is he going to frame it? And how is he going to frame the new covenant for a people who really have no idea of what the new covenant is like? So have you guys ever wondered why we drive on the right side of the road and some places in the world drive on the wrong side of the road? Like, have you guys ever thought about that? And I stumbled upon this explanation a while back ago, and it turns out that, like a lot of things, it comes from a historical background of the way that people just used to do things. When people rode on horseback, they would sit on the right side. They would drive on the left. They would ride their horse on the left side of the road, because that would allow them to either greet somebody with their hand or slice their head off with a sword. So they would always ride on the left side of the road because it allowed their dominant hand to be free to interact with the other people that were on the right side of the road. A little bit later, you had carriages come along, and if you had a 4-horse configuration like the one up on the screen, you would ride on the back left horse, because that will, again, allow your dominant right hand to control the horses. But now, riding on the left side doesn't allow you to control which horse is where, so people ended up switching sides, and they would ride with a carriage on the right-hand side. So depending on what part of the world you were from and what the laws were that governed how horses rode, that's what cars had to obey. So in some parts of the world, we drive on the right-hand side because we're right, and some places you drive on the left side because you're wrong. And the interesting thing is that there aren't a lot of places that have done that switch in modern times, but there are a few. One of them was Samoa in the Pacific Islands, and another one was Sweden. And Sweden actually did their change from left side to right side in the late 60s. And at that time, Sweden was the only country in the world it was the only country in mainland Europe who still drove on the left side of the road. And that caused a whole lot of problems that the government didn't really like. They couldn't export the cars that they made in Sweden, so the cars in Sweden would be made with the steering wheel on the right-hand side so that people could drive on the left side of the road. So they couldn't export their cars to the other parts of the world. Tourists would come and get into accidents because all of a sudden they're used to driving on the right side of the road, and all of a sudden everybody's on the wrong side of the road, and tourists would get into accidents. And then the Swedish, when they'd go abroad, to the next country over, they would also get into accidents because they'd be used to driving on the left side of the road. So what would happen is the government basically said, okay, we're making this switch. We're going to have signs. We're going to have all of these. They even had a song for the transition, and they had a sign like that. That's not a Hillary sign. That's the H-Day sign that they had. And the crazy thing is that the people voted against the switch, but the government, like in any good democracy, said, screw you guys, we're just going to do what we want to do anyway. And they did. So on September 3rd, 1967 at 5 a.m. was H-Day. And H-Day, there's a really long Swedish word. I'm not going to pronounce it. It's the same deal with IKEA furniture. I'm just going to make a fool of myself if I try. And this H-Day basically stands for the day when traffic was diverted from left to right. And like any good transition that's done on such a wide scale, it was a swimming failure. I mean, people were just confused, and the photos from that day basically look like just mass chaos. People are trying to switch lanes, they're trying to do all of these things, and it was a big mess. Eventually they managed to do it, but that transitionary period was very, very painful. Now, Sweden, cars had been only around for about 60 years at that point. So Sweden had to basically take people's ingrained, learned skills of 60 years and say, okay, overnight, all of that's going out the window, we're driving on the right side of the road. But it really was just an automotive thing. You know, people didn't all of a sudden have to walk on one side of the road, and, you know, cars didn't drive upside down. It was just drive on the opposite side. The task that was cut out for Jesus was much more monumental, was much more epic. Jesus didn't come and say, okay, now everybody's driving on the right hand of the road. What he said is the 1,500 years that Israel has been around, the 1,500 years that we've had these Mosaic laws, all of that's going out the window to a degree. And we're going to have a new set of laws. We're going to have a new covenant. We're going to have a new promise that God is giving to you. And this was a problem because this wasn't just related to vehicles. This was related to the identity of Israel nation. Everything from how they decided on morals to how they decided on political systems, how they decided what was religiously acceptable, what was not acceptable, what was societally acceptable and not acceptable. All of that was basically transformed. And that's a lot harder to change than, you know, which side of the road you drive on. Now, Sweden had songs, it had signs, it had flyers to change how people thought, to explain this change to people. Jesus didn't have printing presses. He didn't have radios. He didn't have loudspeakers. He couldn't get the message out the way that Sweden would have done for H-Day. He had to do it through a way that was understandable, that people could absorb into their lives. And he did that through parables. So parables, again, like I said last time, parables are internally consistent. In other words, you can take a parable on its own and it will have a meaning of its own. And it's like looking at a picture, and you have this picture, and there's going to be a picture up on the screen for you guys. And it's a painting of the Good Samaritan parable, where the man went out into the road and he found a man who had been robbed, who had been beaten, and he came and he took that man and he healed him. And this parable is self-contained. It has a meaning that you don't need additional parables to explain it. However, if you were to zoom out of this specific painting, if you zoom out, and in the next picture you'll see, it's actually part of another painting. This painting is inside of another painting. This painting that you see up here is David Teniers the Younger, Archduke Leopold, in his gallery in Brussels. So when you zoom out a little bit, yes, you've got this parable. Yes, you've got this self-contained story. But when you zoom out, all of a sudden, the story merges. All of the parables come together, and they all become consistent, not just on their own, but together as a whole. There's a unified message. There's a unified goal. And the parables illustrated to people that even though you grew up under this old covenant, let me explain this new covenant to you. It's almost exactly the same in terms of what is required of you. It just requires you to think about God in a different way. It requires you to understand how God acts in a different way. So what we're going to talk today about is the God of the old covenant versus the God of the new covenant. And what Jesus wanted to explain from the very get-go is these are not two different gods. This is what the apostles, when they went out to the different churches, when they went out to the different synagogues as they were spreading the gospel, were trying to explain. This is not a new God. This is not a new message. This isn't a new God. This is the exact same God that we have been worshiping for 1,500 years. We're just explaining to you why the old covenant has lost its power, why it could not do what it was intended to do. And Jesus reiterates this over and over again, and he tries to make the point that I'm not here to overturn the law. I'm here to clarify it, and I'm here to make it all the more powerful. All of you are familiar with the parable of the prodigal son. And for the longest time, I thought the word prodigal meant bad or evil or somehow malicious. But that's not what the word means. The word prodigal actually means wasted. In other words, it's talking about a son who wasted the opportunities that he had. He wasted the gifts that he was given. He wasted the grace that he had. He wasted the love that was offered to him. And what Jesus basically wanted to say is that God is still the God of the Old Testament. He is still a merciful God. He's still a God that when you come to him, there is no hole you have to dig yourself out of. The lowest point that you will ever start with God is at zero. You will start with a clean slate, a blank slate, and he'll build you up from there. There isn't a point where you're going to come to God and God's going to say, you know what? You've lived a terrible life. You've got 80 years that you lived of complete debauchery, of complete rejection of my principles. You're going to have to dig yourself out for 80 years until you can reach zero, and then we're going to work with you until you build yourself up. For a lot of people, that would be kind of the end point. It's like, Lord, I've got like 2 more years at most, at 80. I'm not going to live another 80 years to dig myself out. But that's not the requirement that's placed on us. God of the Old Testament said to Israel over and over again, for generations you have rejected me. For generations, you and your children and your grandchildren, all of you said, we don't need you. And then the Assyrians came, and then the Babylonians came, and they took them away. And all of a sudden, Israel is brought to its senses, and it says, God, please come back to us. And he says, I'm ready to take you. As soon as you are ready to accept me, I'm willing to take you back. And that's what the prodigal son showed, is that God is willing to take you back no matter what has happened. And even though the covenant changed, God also wants to make it clear, Jesus also wanted to make clear that God himself did not change. The things that are in the New Testament are not the only things that we're obeying. So the things that Jesus came and said are not the only things that we're obeying. But at the same time, everything that's in the Old Testament is not a mandatory requirement that we obey. What ended up happening is we had a merger. We had some laws which were superseded. So in other words, murder is no longer just physically murdering, it's just even hating a person. But at the same time, we had all of the rituals, all of the things that needed to be done in the temple. All of that was said, that's put aside. It's been superseded by Jesus and his sacrifice, by Jesus and him as the high priest. So we've got this weird merger where not everything that's in the New Testament, not that the New Testament is it. In other words, you can't just read the New Testament and say, these are the only laws that apply. But at the same time, you can't read the Old Testament and say, you know what? We have not killed anybody this week for blasphemy, so we have to get on it. So you have this merger, but at the same time, God still remains the same. And what the New Covenant did was, when it came down, it wasn't just an improvement, like an iterative improvement. This wasn't version 1.0 or 2.0 of the covenant. The covenant was quantitatively better. In other words, qualitatively better. In other words, it was not just slightly better. It wasn't just a little bit better. It was qualitatively better. And in Hebrews, it actually explains how much better it was. In Hebrews 8:13, it says, and he said, a new covenant. He has made the first obsolete, but whatever is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to disappear. Now, like I said, this isn't Covenant 1.0 and 2.0. This isn't iPhone 6 and 6S, where as soon as the new one comes out, you're like, oh man, the angle of the bevel on my phone is off and it doesn't look as nice. No. This is as though Tim Cook stood on stage and he said, this is the Apple iPhone 7 or whatever, the new one's coming out. And all of a sudden, like all around the world, people's phones just start like breaking up. Like the screen just shatters on a million iPhone 6s and people are like, oh my goodness, they must have announced a new phone. This is what's happening here, is this covenant is so much better that the old one literally starts crumbling under its own weight. This isn't just a slightly better covenant, this is a significantly better covenant. And the reason that it's significant, the reason that it's so much better, is it does something that the old covenant could never do. The old covenant, the point of all the sacrifices, the point of the temple, the point of having priests and Levites and having all these people serving in the temple was not to get rid of sin. They couldn't possibly do that. The point of it was to cover up the sin. It was a way of hiding the sin from God so God's anger would not be poured out on Israel. And that's where the fault of the covenant was. It could not make any person clean. It could not purify the hearts of the people who were bringing the sacrifices. It could not purify the hearts of the people who were burning the sacrifices in the temple for God. All it could do is temporarily cover up until the next mess up that a person had. It didn't change the heart. It would cover up that sin, you would sin again, and new sin would float to the top. You'd sacrifice another goat or cow, and that would be poured out, and it would cover that sin. You'd sin again, and you'd have this layer and layer of sin that would never be cleansed. It's like the dust in some of our houses, I think. There's one layer of dust from when we had the party, and it's like all glittery. Then there's the next time when our family came over, all the kids were running, so there's like dust. And then we started painting, and we just painted over that dust, so there's like a layer of paint and a layer of dust and a layer of glitter, and then underneath that, and that's what you had. You had this stack of sin that couldn't be washed. And as a result, all you could do to God is offer sacrifice and not get a permanent solution, get a temporary solution. And that's where the new covenant was different. Because what Jesus came in and said is, look, this isn't just going to be a covering of the sin. This is going to be a complete cleansing of the sin. With Jesus going up on the cross, a lot of us think that he went up there and he died for our sins. But what really ended up happening is you ended up putting all of the sin on Jesus. Jesus ended up taking all of that sin on himself, and the punishment for sin is death. And he basically said, okay, sin, I'm taking you with me. If I'm dying, I'm taking you with me. And he not only forgave us all our sins, he literally, he destroyed sin. He destroyed death. And that's what he was able to achieve. And that's an amazing, amazing fact, because the sin was no longer just going to be covered. The sin was absolutely destroyed. So God not only does not see the sin is no longer there. And when Jesus did that, what he gave humanity was an ability to change the motivation for how they worked. In the Old Testament, there was one kind of motivation, and in the New Testament, there's a different kind of motivation. And I wanted to read a few passages where we basically talk about what the motivation was in the Old Testament and what the motivation and why it didn't really work. So Deuteronomy 28, 1 and 2. We're not going to read the whole passage. It's kind of scary. But we'll just read the first two. Now it shall be, if you diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all his commandments which I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. All these blessings will come upon you and overtake you if you obey the Lord your God. And then it goes through 11 verses of blessings. So your city will be blessed. And it's like, okay, that makes sense. If I'm good, my city will be blessed. Your children will be blessed. And it's like, that makes sense. I agree. My children should be blessed if I obey. You will be blessed. It's like, finally, we get to me. I will be blessed. That's wonderful. But here's the thing. There's 11 verses. And then on verse 15, we see what happens if Israel disobeys. And this is where the scary part begins. And this is where the power of the old covenant was. And it says in verse 15, Deuteronomy 28:15, but it shall come about if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe, to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I charge you today, that all these curses will come upon you and overtake you. And here's the thing. We had 11 verses of blessing, and we're going to follow it with 56 verses of curses. There's going to be 56 different paragraphs that say, this will be cursed and this will be cursed. And here's the thing. We cover all of those things that were blessed in the 11 verses of blessings. We cover the city, we cover the family, we cover you. But it goes beyond that. Everything that you have will be cursed. There's even a passage that says, even the bowl in which you make your bread, in which you make your salad, that will be cursed. God is saying literally everything from the top down will be cursed. Your kitchen's utensils will be cursed. Your forks will be spongy. Your knives will be dull. Everything will be cursed. And in the very end, after all of that happens, I will come and I will make sure that the nations that are around you are able to conquer you and that they take you away. And that was the old covenant. It says, I will give you all of these amazing things. There's this wonderful example of, here's this wonderful carrot. You know, we say the carrot and the stick, where there's this wonderful carrot. Here, chase it. But the stick that the old covenant had was a lot sharper than the one in that picture. It had spikes. It had glass shards built into it. It's like, this is going to hurt a lot. Here is your carrot, follow it. It's a wonderful carrot. But here's a stick. It's 56 verses of stick and 11 verses of carrot. And there's a lot of incentive not to step out of line. Whatever you think you kind of make a rule for yourself, if I step, or your parents do for you, where like if you step out of line, if you get a B on your report card, you're not watching TV for a week. The Old Testament did that 100 times over. It's like your parents saying, if you get a B on your report card, we're shipping you out to boarding school, we're finding adoptive parents, we might find Saddam Hussein or something, and we're going to adopt you to that person. Like, it's way out of proportion, you would think. The reality is, God really did not like sin. And for Israel, it was, I really don't like sin. The degree to which I don't like it, you can gauge from the amount of punishment that you will endure if you do not follow it. And the thing is, Jesus basically wanted to say, now there's these two ideas that you're going to have in your head. You're going to have an idea where the old covenant is super painful, a lot of punishment in it, and then we're going to have this new covenant, one that gives you freedom. And he explains those two different covenants through parables where he talks about new cloth, new wine, old wineskins. And the basic idea of those is you've got this new patch of cloth, and you've got an old garment. If you stick that piece of cloth onto that garment, a lot of us will never do that in our life. If there's ever a hole in our t-shirt, we just toss it or we use it for rags. But in the olden days when you literally had to sew your t-shirts, that was a lot more relevant. But what he's saying is, if you take that old garment and you stick a new patch to it, when you wash that garment, the new patch will pull away. They're not compatible. The old garment is made of one type of material, the patch is made of another type of material. The old garment is one age, the new patch is another age. They are not compatible. He also brings up that example of new wine and old wine. He basically says if you take new wine and you pour it into old wine sacks, so they didn't have bottles back then, there was no, BC 800 vintage wine that you would scrawl on the side of a bottle. What you had are these skins that were animal skins sewn together, and you'd pour wine into them. And after time, the old wine skins, after resting on the shelf, they would get crumbly, they'd get old, they would be more fragile than when they started off. And if you stuck new wine in there, the new wine would ferment, expand, and blow apart your wine skins, and you'd lose it. And that's what Jesus was trying to make a point here, is you can't apply the same thinking that you applied before to now. And what was the thinking that they applied? The thinking was an outside to inside transformation. If I force myself, if I put enough pressure on myself, eventually that pressure will force the law of God through my skin, through my organs, through the outside of my rib cage, and into my heart, and then my heart will be pure. And that was the Old Testament thought. If there's enough pressure on you outside, it will force your heart to transform itself. But the one thing that Moses didn't realize, that Israel didn't realize, is how much of a wall you can build around your heart that none of that will work. Your body will turn into a diamond and your heart will still be the same corrupt heart no matter how much pressure you put on it. And Jesus basically, he saw that everywhere that he went. He called out the Pharisees on this because he said, look, you've applied this thinking quite well. The pressure that you've applied to yourselves, it's formed this nice, luxurious, chrome-plated, shiny crust around your heart, around your body. You look phenomenal. If Moses saw what the Pharisees looked like, if Moses saw what the temple looked like, he'd be blown away. He'd say, wow, we started off in animal skin tents in the middle of the desert, and now look at us. But the reality is if you started scraping that top coat off, it would reveal the same old broken human nature that was in the desert, that was in Adam and Eve, that was back to the beginning of time. And Jesus basically said, look, you guys are whitewashed walls. You've done a really good job on the outside, but then you've taken an extended multi-year lunch break. And you were not able to get into where the change actually had to be. And we have a lot of examples of this kind of in our life. I think the one that's most prevalent is when we try to change our kids, or when your parents try to change you. And there's basically, two ways of going about it. And a dad, he was doing a sermon, and he did an illustration where he was telling his son to sit down. And I don't remember if they were in church or at home, but the son was being, rowdy, and he was getting up, and he was standing, and the dad's like, sit down, and the son's like, no, I don't want to sit down. He's like, sit down or I'm going to punish you. And the kid's like, okay, the punishment is severe. So he sits down, but he gets the last jab, and then he says to his dad, it's like, I'm sitting, but in my heart, I'm standing. And that's basically what happens is, yes, I'm on the outside, I'm sitting, but in my heart, I'm standing. The goal of every parent is not to take their kid and transform him into this individual where whenever the parent is looking, the kid is good. That is not the goal of any parent. And if a parent goes out and sees their kid, doing donuts in the church parking lot, the reaction is not, oh my goodness, I saw you doing donuts in the church parking lot. The reaction is, oh my goodness, I didn't teach you well enough that you would know not to do that. And that's the goal of every parent. And I think anybody who has a family, who wants to have a family, realizes that that is not the right way that a child needs to be taught. It's not that I don't want you to see you doing these things. It's I don't want it to be in your heart. I want to raise up a child. I want my children, when they grow up, not to be looking over their shoulder to see if their parents are watching. I want children who know what the right thing is that they need to do. So that when I am there, they're doing the right thing, and when I'm not, they know inside of their heart what the right thing to do is, and they do it. And that's what Jesus was trying to say to Israel. On the outside, you're sitting, but on the inside, you're still standing. There wasn't a transformation inside. There wasn't a change inside. And the question is why? And you might say, well, that mode of thinking has gone out of style. And you might be right. I mean, if it has gone out of style, then we really wouldn't have family-oriented politicians getting caught up in sex scandals. We wouldn't have people who devoted their entire life to church being caught up in child sex scandals. We wouldn't have a world where all of this happened. But wait, we do. Human nature has not changed. People still build this crust around themselves. And you might not be involved in some kind of police sting operation as a result of your choices, but you still build up this crust of, I need to look good on the outside. But you don't devote enough time to figuring out, well, do I look good on the inside? And that's a shame. The new covenant is not really concerned with what you look like on the outside. And that's because the new covenant, it starts in a different place. The old covenant created pressure from the outside that would slowly permeate in and change your heart. The new covenant says, I'm going to start on the inside, and I'm going to break through that wall around your heart, and then everything else is going to come out. All that stuff you've been trying to contain inside will now be good stuff, and it'll just flow freely. For those of you who converted, if you think back to that time, the thing that you'll remember first, before the tears, before the quivering lips, is you'll recognize something happened in your heart. There was something that changed in your mind. A switch got flipped that hadn't flipped before. And before any tears, before any action that you physically took, there was a battle inside. There was something going on inside. And you were sitting in the pews, and before your heart started racing even, there was a realization that I can't go on the way that I've gone on before. Before the tears started flowing from your eyes, there was a realization. And that's what I'm talking about, is that's what the new covenant is capable of doing. It's capable of making that transformation from the inside. Before there is any kind of sign on the outside, there is a sign on the inside that only you know of. And that is what the new covenant is concerned with. We associate conversion, we associate people coming to Jesus with the tears. And you might associate that. But that is not what the conversion actually is. Those might be signs. For some people they're there, for some people they're not. But for every single person who truly gave their life over to Jesus, there will always be an internal transformation. You might not have tears, but there will be an internal transformation that will change the way that you think. There was a parable that played off of this fact. The Pharisee and the tax collector. We always say, well, the Pharisee had one point of view, the tax collector had another. But what I want to frame it for you is what was going on in the hearts of those two men. The Pharisee's heart was hardened, and he had a self-assured heart that he was good. He's like, from what I can see in the mirror, I'm doing well. I've made my top coat, and it looks nice. With the tax collector, his transformation started in from the inside. He looked at his heart, he looked at his motivations, and he realized that they were not in line with what he wanted them to be, what he saw God asking of him. And before he ever came to the temple, fell on his knees and cried out to God, there was a change in thinking for him. Each one of us is supposed to have that change of thinking first. And you can say, well, I wouldn't be like that. I've got willpower. I've got strength. I can make that transformation from the outside in. There's a lot of people, and especially those who maybe haven't been exposed to the gospel, they have that thinking that I can become a good person on my own. But they fail to realize that we've already tried going down that route. There's a few times in history that there's only a few ways that we can split humanity into two groups. And for me, the two groups are, there are people who looked at what their parents or other parents have done, and they've said, I'm never going to do that in my life ever. I'm going to be a better parent than they ever were. I am never going to yell at my kid in Walmart, and I'm never going to do all of these things. And there's that group, and then the complementary group is people who have actually had kids. So those are the two groups. And for me, it was, I promised myself, before we had any kids, before we ever got married, I would never, ever, 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 never, that was not going to be a word in my vocabulary of because I told you so. I was never going to use that phrase. That was not going to be the phrase. No matter how silly the questions might have been, however pointless they might have been, I committed myself to saying, I will answer every single question, and I will give them a response, and I will keep answering questions until they're satisfied. Why is the sky blue? Easy, because of the diffraction of dust particles. Why does soap work? Well, because you've got a bipolar molecule and does this and this and this. Easy question. Why do I have to go to bed? That is the most difficult question in the whole wide world. Because you're tired. No, I'm not. Because your head won't work well in school tomorrow. Yes, it will. Because all the other kids in the neighborhood have already gone to bed. But I don't want to. But you have to. No, I don't. Yes, you do. Why? Just go. No, go. Why? Because I told you so. And that's the moment when everything just pauses, and like you hear the music in the background, and it says, hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you. And like, you can see that, like everything's slow motion, and it's like, it's happened. I've become that person. We all like to think that we're special, that we're unique, that somehow the abilities that we have, that the heart that we have is somehow different from everybody else. Everybody likes to think that they're above average, but in reality, everybody's right around the center. And that applies to the evilness of our hearts as well. We like to think that we have more willpower, we have more strength, we have more resolve. We are going to battle through this. We will get that gospel message in through our thick skin. We will get it through our heart, and we will just pound it out, and we will be a good person. But what does the reality of that look like? Psalm 81, 11 to 12. But my people did not listen to my voice, and Israel did not obey me. So I gave them over to the stubbornness of their heart to walk in their own devices. Jeremiah 7:24, yet they did not obey or incline their ear, but walked in their own counsels and in the stubbornness of their evil heart, and went backward and not forward. Judges 2:9, but it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. And there were two people in that temple on that day. There was the person who thought, I can control my evil heart. I can control the things that come out of me. And there was a person who realized that he cannot. That his heart is strong enough for a day. His heart is strong enough for a week. His heart might even be strong enough for a good part of his lifetime. But in the end, it will still have that inside of him. That evil desire, that desire to do things that feel good rather than the things that are right. And the Pharisee, he studied the law of God, and he did not realize the depravity of his own heart. He did not realize how far his heart could fall every single day. And in the end, he thought he was doing a good job. He thought that he was getting through to his heart. He thought he was cleansing himself. He thought he was washing himself. And the apostles, when in Romans 7:23, he writes, "O wretched man that I am, who's going to deliver me from this body of death?" And the reality is, nobody. Nobody will save you from this flesh. Until the day you die, you will always have the same body, the same instincts, the same desires that you've had from birth. You'll have the same desires and instincts that Israel had in the desert, that the apostles had in their bodies as they were struggling to reconcile what they saw in Jesus and what they wanted in their life. You have the same body and mind that your parents had. And the mistakes that your parents made, you might not make because you're not in the same situation, but you will make different mistakes. And if you try to beat yourself into submission, there is no stick big enough. There is no threat dreadful enough for you to affect your heart. Hell could be presented to you on a platter, and you could look into it, and that would not be enough to change your heart. It doesn't change your heart. It gives you fear. It gives you a desire not to end up there, but it doesn't change your heart. It doesn't change who you are. It doesn't change what you want and your desires. And you might say, well, what's the point? And the point is that if we apply this outside-inside thinking to our spiritual lives, we won't get anywhere. Jesus went through the parables one by one, and he tried to show that that's not the way that you succeed. The way that you succeed is from a desire to change your heart, a desire to change the way that you think. It's not the, I won't do this because I'm afraid. It's the, I'm going to do this because I love my Father. It's the same reason that kids do what they're supposed to do. They're not afraid of their parents' punishment anymore. They know what's right and what's wrong. They've had a transformation of the heart. They've had a transformation of the mind. And that's what I want to call all of you to, is a transformation of the heart and mind. I'm not concerned with how you look on the outside. I'm not concerned if your conversion involves tears or doesn't involve tears. What I want to be sure of, what I want you to be sure of, is that your heart is not the same that it has always been. That your heart is pursuing other desires. And when that happens, everything else will fall in line. If your heart is full of goodness, if your heart is full of a desire to serve God, it will radiate out of you. No top coat will be able to hide it or cover it or prevent it from getting out. With evil, you can do that. You can put on a top coat that might never get out, but be full of rottenness inside. But with the new covenant, with the gospel, with the message that Jesus brought, that he illustrated through the parables, there's no way that that will happen. Your outside will naturally be transformed. Your outside will naturally change. It will no longer look the same, but only if you open your heart for that opportunity. Let us stand and pray and ask God that he would open our hearts that way, and that we would have a transformation from the inside out. I'll give you a moment to pray quietly, and then I'll conclude in prayer. Heavenly Father, we are most thankful. We're most thankful for the message of Jesus, Lord, that he brought. That you found us not worthy of a new covenant, but that you gave it to us anyway. A covenant that allows us to change our heart first. Lord, let us see that no matter how big of a stick we beat ourselves with, we will never have a transformation of the heart unless we change the heart. Let your Holy Spirit come down on us, Lord. Let it live inside of us. Let it give us a soft heart, not a heart of stone. A heart that's willing to accept you, a heart that's willing to change. That we may live it out every single day. That we would stop beating ourselves up in an attempt to become holy, but that we would surrender to you and to the salvation that we get through your Son, Jesus Christ. We ask all that in his name. Amen.